All right, great. So look, just by way of an agenda. So the way that we'll structure this webinar is, a quick walkthrough of some recent events around threats and breaches in relation to data privacy. We'll look back on regulatory trends as well as some very important upcoming regulations, both here in Australia as well as abroad. Most of which I'm sure won't be news to those in attendance to the webinar. Market concerns, so, how are organisations responding? And some observations, as I mentioned, based on what we're seeing in the local Australian market, plus also in some of our dealings abroad, around how organisations are actually ensuring that they either avoid breaches to begin with, but if they have a breach, how do they manage that effectively? And we've also got some examples around how organisations are leveraging tools to enable effective privacy management, which if we have time, we can show you. I'm just going to make this large so everyone can see that. But in relation to the threats and how those threats have eventuated into actual breaches, there's four key categories that we're really seeing both locally and abroad. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with the term hacktivism. Let's say that properly. So where essentially, there's increasingly local and state governments, hacktivism efforts going after, in the interests of their own goodwill, so to speak. Organised crime is obviously a big issue globally. We've had the recent events of WannaCry 2's come through as well. You've got nation-state-sponsored cyber attacks. We're very well aware of what happened with the recent American elections. But most importantly, and that's why we tried to make this the biggest box on the slide, is relates to insider threats. I personally really enjoyed what IBM came up with as a statement last year, where they stated that data breaches were up 566% from the previous year, so from 2015, which is a real concern considering what's happening in the data privacy space. Not to mention also, what's happened recently here in Melbourne, as well as Australia. So, there was a recent event where dozens of patients' medical records were found outside of a hospital, literally dumped on a Melbourne street, as well as where Medicare numbers were actually able to be purchased on the dark web, and how that eventuated. So all of this really means that the threats are real and the breaches are evidence of that. Just looking back from a regulatory perspective, what's interesting is that the first data protection law was passed back in 1970, back in Germany. And it's interesting to see how that's evolved through to us here in Australia, with the Privacy Act being launched in 1988. There's been several data breaches from that time, to the extent that, again, here in Australia, the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner was established in 2010. Again, numerous mass surveillance disclosures and all that occurred during that time, or between 2010 and 2016. And what we then found was that the EU, including the UK, decided to pause what is being referred to as the boogeyman of data. It's essentially the General Data Protection Regulation. So, and the implications of that, and it varies, I suppose the regulations are being interpreted country by country across the EU and the UK. But overall, the implications of that is that in the event of a breach, organisations can be fined up to 20 million euros. Sorry, that should be euros, not dollars, or 4% of global revenue. So that is massive and is one of the largest of fines that can be incurred to date in the context of a data privacy breach. What's interesting in relation to this is it doesn't mean that this is only applicable to EU and UK organisations. Subsidiaries are also impacted, and some have also have formed the view that even if an organisation abroad, so outside of the EU and the UK, actually holds EU or UK citizen data and that gets breached, that they may also be eligible or impacted by the regulation. So that's a very interesting point of view on the regulation. I was talking to a Chief Information Security Officer of a company here in Melbourne whose owned or whose holding company is based in the UK. And so I think she said, well, you know, if you breach, you know, what does that mean? You know, what you could just say, well, we're not going to pay, we're based here in Australia. And the legal advice that they got was that the regulators will actually go after the holding companies and start seizing the assets of the holding companies if the subsidiaries didn't actually pay up on the fines that they were eligible to pay. So I suppose everyone's interpreting it a little bit differently, and we can talk about that a little bit more as we go through subsequent slides. That's all very related to the GDPR. More importantly, especially for us here in Australia, in 2017, after 4 years plus of trying to get the legislation through Parliament, it was eventually passed, and that is the Notifiable Data Breach Reporting Bill of 2016. For those that are not aware of this, the implications of a personal data breach include $360,000 for individuals. So as an individual, if you have a data breach that represents serious harm to the individuals implicated by that breach, you could be eligible for up to $360,000. And for corporations, that's $1.8 million per breach. So again, the fines are not small. The implications are real. The notifiable data breach reporting requirement becomes effective in February of next year. The GDPR regulation becomes enforceable in May of next year. So no one really knows exactly how the regulators are actually going to approach this practically. The theory is there. So, you know, everyone is, I suppose, having different points of view and approaching it in different ways. And again, we'll be able to share some of those insights with you based on what we're seeing in the local market. So firstly, there's major concerns based on what we're hearing through our existing customers, as well as when we're either demonstrating our products and meeting with senior executives at conferences, etc. And the big thing is essentially there's all these opposing priorities. You've got all these regulations that are coming through, but then there's, you know, the whole intent to reduce costs, you know, maximize value from data. You know, how do we do things more effectively and efficiently through the use of Bimodal IT, including DevOps, etc. You know, how do we do things faster while still trying to manage the speed of change? Our environments are very complicated. We've got data everywhere, you know, across structured, semi-structured, and unstructured data repositories. Where do we start? So it's left a lot of organizations with several conundrums based on what we're seeing. Continuing that way of thought, you know, the types of questions that we're hearing are, you know, will we have to comply? You know, what are we eligible for, maybe, or we realize that we're likely to be eligible under the mandatory reporting requirement. Do we have to comply with the likes of GDPR? What qualifies for an eligible data breach? When do we report? Mandatory breach, the scheme actually, the bill actually talks about serious harm to an individual. So what actually constitutes serious harm? What's the definition of that? Are they exposed? Where is their sensitive personal data across their organization? How much do they have? And then kind of going into a bit more detail around how that is further complicated across various organizations. So, the likes of those complex information and technology landscapes that I was referring to on the subsequent slide. So you've got all these legacy technologies that are handling and or storing your data. The IP and the understanding of those have been lost over time. You're now moving into a world of new technologies within the cloud, big data. Essentially, it's essentially becoming very, very hard to understand where that personal data is, understand how to manage it effectively, and therefore limit the likelihood of breaching the upcoming regulations. So, how are organizations responding? This is a very interesting slide that we pulled together. I suppose firstly, what we're finding in the majority of organizations that we're dealing with is they're establishing an organizational definition and view of what the regulations really mean to their organization. And what we mean by that is some are referring to it as a house view of the regulations. So actually having a definition of what constitutes a breach, how does the regulations then get integrated within their existing policies, standards, risk management processes, so that it's very clear to people within the organization as to, what they should be doing, when they have a breach, what constitutes a breach, what are the associated roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities. So very much at that organizational level or lens within each of the enterprises. In addition to that, we're finding that a lot of organizations are performing what we refer to as qualitative risk assessments. So what we mean by that is that they are getting a lot of SMEs into various seminars or sessions or working groups. And the whole idea there is that they follow a standard risk management process as defined by ISO 31000. And the whole idea is to actually go and say, well, where do we think our personal data is originates within our organization, and how does it traverse through its life cycle, and what are all the what are the locations that data is handled, stored, transformed as it traverses through its life cycle. Once they have that understanding, they then again start looking at the types of controls that they've got, over that data as it traverses through its life cycle. So, trying to understand the controls that they have from a technology perspective, including user access management, logical security, etc., but also manual compensating controls. Now, that is already a great step from a maturity perspective. The limitation that we see, and we've been told with that, is it is a subjective and qualitative assessment of where that data really is within the organization. Therefore, that you are, or those organizations that are undertaking this activity are essentially exposed to the unknowns. You're heavily reliant on information that's in people's heads, what they know, what they understand, and essentially if that understanding has been lost over time, there will be gaps in relation to that assessment. So, how are others overcoming the limitations of those qualitative risk assessments? So what we're finding is that there are actually a number of organisations that are supplementing their qualitative assessments with data discovery tools. And what we mean by that is they're actually using technology to actually go and perform discovery over what the SMEs have said, that's where our personal data essentially originates from and where it's stored, handled, etc. But in addition to that, they're also using those tools to start uncovering the unknowns, so the information that has actually, or the understanding that has been lost over time. That is, I suppose, the next level of maturity that we're seeing from our perspective to further mitigate the risks relating to understanding, where that personal data is within and across the enterprise. Those three activities are all well and good in trying to understand and prevent a breach from actually happening. That said, the majority out there realize that they will incur some form of breach in the next 12 to 24 months, and therefore, let's start preparing for that proactively. So what they're doing is they're actually beginning to establish breach response teams, including processes and working out how they test those proactively. So what that means is that in the event of a breach, they're actually making sure that they've got roles and responsibilities defined with standard operating procedures to actually quantify the breach and also respond to it to minimize the impact. So that, and that's also, I suppose, a proactive measure to minimize the impact of that breach, and therefore doing the right thing by their customers, their employees, but also minimizing the extent that the regulators are going to go after them. In addition, following on from the various risk assessments that are being performed, those are going to be identified, or those will and have identified various control deficiencies. So there's already plans in place to work out, where do they need to optimize controls, executing on those plans, how do they de-identify or obfuscate that data within certain zones, what does user access management look like, and essentially, or one of the key controls being role-based access control. So how do we make sure that users within or employees within the organization only have access to the data that they need in order to perform their role, and that includes personal data. I suppose last but not least, and this one always brings a little bit of a smile to my face, is some are actually doing nothing. So, and that could be one of two reasons. So firstly, they don't have any personal data that they need to really worry about, or the extent that they have it is very limited, and they know where it is, and they believe that they are protected, or that they have the data, but again, the general perception is that they have everything under control. So I'm sure the majority of us at the webinar wish we were in that final bucket. This final, or one of the semi-final slides are some questions that we've compiled to essentially start asking, or enabling our customers to start asking questions around how prepared are they in relation to the upcoming regulations being enforced next year. So step one is, do you know what PII is important that you have within your organization, as well as where it's located? I was talking to a head of security just yesterday, and it was very interesting to hear his or interpretation being, well, we need to be very clear around what we constitute PII as. Reason being is that I could literally find your name, probably your email address, probably your actual physical address, just by doing some searches online. So, you know, is that really an impact if we were to breach? And, you know, so their perspective was, but, you know, if we start breaching, you know, our names, plus maybe, you know, any health information, medical history, well, that's important. And, you know, that's great. That's how they've interpreted the regulation. Others would probably beg to differ if you read the Australian privacy principles around what constitutes PII, but they've made a clear and concise decision around what's important to them in relation to complying with the regulations. On the flip side is once they've actually, or once organisations have said this is what's important, you know, aligning back to that organisational view, which I spoke about in subsequent slides, is once we say this is what our personal, this is the definition of personal data in the context of our organisation, this is what we've agreed from a policies and standards perspective. Okay, now do we know exactly where it is located? Do we know how it flows through its life cycle? Are we sure that it's controlled? So step 2, do you know how your business plans could make these assets more vulnerable? This was a very interesting question for us in relation to how an organization's business strategy could actually make them more vulnerable to a breach. Coming back to those threats that we introduced the webinar with, if an organization has a certain business strategy, maybe it's impacting the climate in some way, they may be more susceptible to the types of threats that we discussed originally on that first slide. So considering, you know, as part of those broader risk assessments, you know, how does our broader strategy actually increase the likelihood that, you know, we could incur a significant breach in the next 12 to 24 months? The third question is, do you understand how your PII or personal data could be accessed or disrupted? It comes back to, do you know where it is? Okay, so once you know where it is, well, how can it be accessed or disrupted? You know, is it just within your organization? Is it hosted externally in some cloud-based environment? Do you hand your data over to third parties? And therefore, you know, are you susceptible to your provider employees actually having access to that data? Again, the regulations are always clear that you can outsource responsibility, but you can never outsource accountability. So therefore, you know, how do you make sure that your contracts with your third parties also have, you know, the back-to-back type controls and control requirements to ensure your personal data is protection there? The fourth one is, would you even know if you were being breached or had been breached? So, you know, if your personal data had been compromised, so, you know, what is your discovery and proactive measures look like to determine that you are being breached or have been breached before it actually lands up in the media? There's numerous times where that has happened, as again, I'm sure that the majority on this call would be aware of. And then the fifth and final question would be, well, what's your plan to react to a breach? Now, how do you minimize the harm that's caused to essentially, you know, limit the likelihood that you are doing serious harm to the individuals that are impacted by that breach, and therefore also minimizing the likelihood of serious fines, media coverage, reputational impact, and the like. Does that make sense? Are there any questions about that? I'll pause there. I've been doing a lot of speaking. No? Excellent. So look, the next few slides are really to cover off on what we're seeing around types of technologies that are being used to enable effective privacy compliance, and also how they're going about in actually doing that. So what we're finding is, you know, a lot of tools out there are really trying to get that 360-degree view of personal data so that they can actually understand, you know, the extent that that data is exposed. And I'll introduce you to one of those as well that's close to our heart. So, you know, the first is being able to automatically, just seeing some messages come up there. Yeah, and also feel free to type up some questions as well through the chat if that's more effective. So look, the types of, I suppose a lot of organisations are beginning to use tools to automatically catalogue, and discover where that data is, establishing business context relating to that personal data. So, you know, where, in what name does it reside? So, I think someone's just gone off mute. If you could just go back on mute, please. There's a bit of background noise on there. So essentially trying to establish the business context of where that data is, so who's accountable for it. Establishing data flow, so lineage is becoming more and more important, especially when you start considering what remediation activities need to be undertaken, either to de-identify where you find that data, but also, you know, going back to where it originates from, so that any remediation activities are better informed, or remediation strategies are better informed. So where's the data coming from, but also where it's going to. You know, the extent that you actually have personal data, so how much have you got? So being able to automatically quantify that and classify it from a confidentiality perspective. So being able to work out automatically, you know, based on the types of data repositories that are being scanned or looked at by said technology, how many sensitive data records do we have, and also what constitutes sensitivity. What I mean by that is being able to look at the various sensitive data attributes, an attribute being the likes of a name, a date of birth, an address, etc. But using that then as a product of the actual volume of records to start automatically scoring to determine the classification of that data. Also building in rules, which is interesting, around weighting each of those attributes that I was referring to. So enabling the likes of, you know, a name attribute to have a higher weighting than an address or a date of birth attribute. The reason behind that, what we're hearing is that if you've got, say, a table that has, 100 customer names, addresses, dates of birth, email addresses, etc. The idea, though, is that if you lose the name column, so you can't actually link the address or the date of birth back to a name or the individual, all of a sudden the question comes, well, you know, is that now really that sensitive? You know, are we actually representing serious harm to an individual if we, you know, that data were to be disclosed and I can't actually link the address and the date of birth back to an individual's name? So, you know, that's quite important from a classification perspective, but also when determining remediation strategies. Number 5 is all around permissions. So being able to automatically unweave the web of roles, both at a network level, but also within applications and across information warehouses, etc., to actually work out who has access to what data. That can be quite a challenge, especially considering the complexity of various environments, you know, from legacy all the way to the new world of cloud and big data. Being able to automatically work out who's using that personal data once you've actually worked out if it is personal and how frequently. How fresh is it? This is quite an interesting component of what these tools are doing, and I suppose you know, that we are hearing conflicting messages from the market on whether, if you do have personal data, but it's 20 years old, how important is that from a breach perspective? But that said, that the tools are just enablers, so being able to have that information to make decisions is also important. And then actually being able to profile those personal data records to work out, how much have you got. So all of those together enable users and organizations to automatically, well, firstly understand how much personal data do they have, being able to automatically classify that data based on its sensitivity, and then also being able to determine, is it exposed based on who's got access to it, the nature of access, who's using it, and how frequently it gets used. And from our perspective, this is an example of one of the tools that we work with that essentially is used to map out those data flows more specifically and actually understand where that data is in an automatic fashion, so that you can actually start determining the extent that you are exposed, and then also working out what action you need to take, both at the considering both the location of where that sensitive data was located, but also where it's coming from, as that may be the more optimal position or place to introduce de-identification or actual security controls to limit the likelihood of disclosure. So I'll pause there. Andrew, I might come back to you just now. It's been very quiet on the phone, so I'm just keen on any thoughts on that you may have, and then perhaps we can open it up to the floor. If anyone on the call is interested, we can actually show you some or one of the tools in action, which actually goes through automatic classification and exposure scoring and what that looks like. I'll take your guidance on how you'd like to proceed with that.
Which version? Yeah, just give a quick demo. I think a demo would be good. Yeah, we've had a few requests for a quick demo.
Okay. Look, and yes,
okay.
the slide deck will definitely be available. So I'm sure Andrew by Don will send that out.
And we're recording it, so that'll be available too.
As mentioned, this is one of the tools that are very close to our heart. It's called Alex. There's a number of use cases which Alex essentially supports, one of which is discovery of personal data, and essentially also understanding where that data is located, where it's coming from, where it's going to, but then also moving into auto classification and exposure scoring. So just I suppose a quick overview. This is a demo instance that's been made available. So essentially, there's various ways that you can view the data or tag the data. And I have just done something. What have I done? And so what I'll do is just show you how we start to actually visualize that data and starting to understand where it's coming from, where it's going to. What we call this view is a Google Maps-like view of enterprise data. You get to understand data locations and flows based on how you've actually tagged the data during the discovery process, and you can view that flow by those different types of tag categories. So one of which would be technology. So I'll just show you that, and you can see on my right-hand side, I've got various tags relating to technology. I can flow that data at a 30,000-foot view of the world based on those tag categories. The reason why we refer to this as a Google Maps-like view of the world, the concept is that if you're looking at the state of ACT or Victoria, at using Google Maps at that 30,000-foot view of the world, you're not necessarily going to see the streets or the houses or the lampposts unless you want to, right, based on the journey that you're going into. So the whole idea is that you can actually start to understand, that you've got Oracle environments, sharing information, between various file systems. You've got various ELT capabilities that are moving the data around, stats, there's various reporting capabilities. And, just having this understanding is a really complicated and non-trivial activity to build out. So the idea is, coming back to the types of tools that I was speaking about previously, is how do you actually automate that understanding and keep it current and sustained? Coming back to that Google Maps analogy is that you can actually start to zoom in on each of these nodes to drill down and actually start to get a better understanding with as much level of detail as you actually wanted to. On the flip side, you can then actually start to go and say, well, show me absolutely everything. I really want to understand my entire landscape. And, usually this type of view can be quite daunting for those seeing it, because it really starts showing, that real complicated view of enterprise data landscape. So that spaghetti-like view, which concerns most organizations, because that's why, they really don't know where that personal data is, and really complicates their ability to comply effectively. How this becomes valuable is essentially you can actually start drilling down into various technologies. So I'll just say, let's focus on why this is important. If we just drill down onto, say, I'm interested in understanding if I've got any personal data on Oracle. So, we've scanned Oracle. We can drill down into Oracle and actually go and, understand what exactly is there. I'm only interested in my sensitive data, so what has been discovered, so get rid of my nones. I'm only interested in, say, my tables and views, to get rid of my columns. And what this has left me with is 45 tables and views in my Oracle environment that essentially contain some form of sensitive data, whether it's names, emails, there's some credit card data, there's location information, there's some gender data. So right then and there, I've been able to drill down into the specifics of where my personal data is within my Oracle environment. My next step is to actually understand, well, okay, I know I've got it on that environment, and I know where it's located based on those tables and views, but how do I know what action I need to take? So in order to do that, I can start drilling down into several dashboards, one of which is what's called a usage dashboard, where I'm enabled, and you'll see the filters are still applied here, saying it's only showing me sensitive data. I've got all my tables and views that are sensitive, and I've actually got user roles that are accessing that data based on logs that have been pulled in. So I can start asking questions about, well, why do I have my engineers essentially accessing my customer details fact view or table that contains my personal data? I can also start going and saying, all right, well, that's a question I need to address, so maybe our role-based access control isn't that effective. But I can also start drilling down into the users themselves. And I can start asking a question going, why is Bob such an active user across that? That doesn't look right either. So already I'm enabled to start querying and asking questions around user activity across my personal data. From understanding how sensitive the data is, as well as is it exposed, there's another dashboard that gets used to reflect the scores that have been applied again on those tables and views. So the principles come back to what I was talking about previously, where you can start working out how sensitive the data is based on volume of records, but also using the volume as a product of the number of sensitive data attributes. Just a reminder, so a sensitive data attribute would be a name, a date of birth, etc. And each of those can have individual weightings as well to actually score how sensitive the data is. And what we've done is we've actually leveraged some basic classifications. So internal being less sensitive versus restricted being very sensitive. the likelihood that it's exposed is based on who's using that data as well as who's got access to that data. So the idea is that, again, you weight it based on those principles, being that the more people who have access to the data and or the more frequently that it's actually used, it becomes more exposed. So you can start drilling down into these to start understanding that in more detail. You know, and here I've actually got a view that was deemed to be highly exposed, so I can start querying that, jumping in, and here we've actually got the columns associated with the view. And what's interesting is it's flagged that that credit card number column got 100% hit for credit cards when it was scanned or profiled. And, you know, I've got other attributes in here like phone numbers, there's names, there's email addresses. So essentially, you know, it's showing I've got 45% of what I've scanned look like emails, 20% look like names. That's also quite common because most email addresses will have names. Email address is also, I suppose, an attribute which enables you to link back to an individual. So it's very similar to names. So it could also have a very heavy weighting from a scoring perspective. You can also see who's using that data. So, you know, and the frequency of that use. So again, you could be like, wow, Sue seems to be a very active user, so that's most likely why it was deemed to be exposed from a usage perspective, as well as who's actually got access to that data, right? So that's all good from an analysis perspective. So, I can understand that it's exposed. You know, I can take action, you know, straight away to actually go and say, well, you know, maybe I'm going to, you know, just delete that sensitive data if it makes sense to do so where I found it because it's exposed. That's probably not the best way to go about, you know, de-identifying or reducing exposure because, you know, either it'll come back the next day as part of a batch process or alternatively, you're going to impact a whole lot of individuals who are using that data. So the benefit of using a tool is that you can actually start going back to its data source. So I'm going to say, give me a lineage on that view, so I can actually go back to the source. So where does that data originate from? And what I can do is I can actually go through and see there's my view. I'll just flow by a different tag category, and I can see there's my view, and I can see that it's actually coming from a different view, and then a table, and there's processes that are pulling it through, all the way through to two source files called customer details.dat and customer account history.dat, and that's originating from my CRM application. So it's probably more effective for me to work out how those source files are being generated and actually de-identify or obfuscate that personal data or that personal data attribute from that source, then actually trying to remediate it back where I actually found it and where it's really exposed. But again, to do that, you know, if we're gonna obfuscate it at that file, you also want to really understand what the impact is of doing that. If I just take you back here, there's that file. I can then go according to the flow. This is why lineage is so important from a privacy compliance perspective. There's the exposed view, and I can actually see it's impacting various reports. I've got dialer dashboards, I've got terms, and, you know, I can even understand, are there any actual users impacted on this? And that'll bring up a whole lot of users that may also be impacted as part of that. So there's Sam, you know, there's Rango, I've got Laura and Kate, etc. So that's just a very quick example of how you can start to use technology to move away from those qualitative assessments, those subjective remediation strategies, to have a more closer quantitative understanding of where that data is, and then also optimizing the remediation activities that you plan and also then execute. And then also not forgetting, how do you then sustain those going forward? So we're 5 minutes before the end of the webinar. I think on the back of that, I'll hand back to Andrew and also see if there's any specific questions.
So has anybody got any particular questions? Does anybody got any questions about how they're using the data? How will they use it? So we've got a question on the chat. So Julian's asking, what about non-relational databases? John, can you talk about that?
Yeah, so non-relational is just another data repository, right? So the example that I showed you in that tool was, of course, a relational database management system. But you do need to understand exactly where that personal data is in any repository, and that could be within a relational database management system. It could be in an unstructured data repository, non-relational, as well as completely unstructured, right? So in flat files or JOF files, etc. So those are all different repositories that would hand or at least store that data. And so being able to make sure, and again, that's what makes it so hard, is that, to do that manually is not the most effective way to do it. So having the right tools and capabilities so that you can actually firstly understand where that data originates and then how it flows, be it from a structured relational database all the way through its life cycle, albeit into a non-relational or some flat file at the end of the day.
Okay. So to see that Ray's got a comment about they're using a different tool, IBM InfoSphere Suite.
Look, that's another good tool, right? So again, that'll help understand where data is located and where it flows to. So the extent that you can do that quantitatively, I'm not that close to InfoSphere's discovery capabilities, but again, the extent that you can actually automate that discovery process and using technology to enable that so you can do it quicker, more effectively, that's really where you're beginning to move up the maturity curve.
Thanks for that question. Has anybody got any other questions? If not, thank you all for attending, and hopefully we'll be able to arrange another one soon.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.